In most shooters, the gameplay space is kinda static. That is to say, it usually stays the same, and how you interact with it stays the same. Multiplayer maps in most popular shooters don't change, which is important because it lets players learn them. Through enough repetition and play, you gain a feeling of mastery over the space. You begin to internalize it, every boundary, every bit of cover, every element you can use to gain advantage. It's space which you can comfortably familiarize yourself with and come to understand. And this is a pretty foundational element of how most competitive shooters work. Mastery, that process of learning and improving at specific aspects of a game as you play, is core to most competitive games. That feeling that you're improving and could always be just a little bit better keeps a lot of players engaged, and not just in multiplayer games. This is a big part of the vast majority of games ever made. People like to be good at things, and specifically in shooters, the avenues of mastery tend to be, though not exactly the same, at least similar. They all tend to place a strong emphasis on mechanical mastery, for example. When it comes down to it, the faster and more accurate shooter will win most direct fights. But the other thing that shooters often expect you to master is the space. Everyone's had that feeling of loading into a new map and not really knowing what's going on, until after a while it coalesces in your head and you begin to get used to it. And while skilled players will often show off their mastery by clicking on your head in a nanosecond, they'll just as often do it by showing off their familiarity with the map, and all the ways you can play in and with the space. This being so standard is a large part of why PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, or PUBG, is so interesting to me. I mean, it's interesting in a lot of ways. There's a good reason it was the harbinger of the whole Battle Royale craze. But in particular, I find myself interested in how PUBG conceptualizes space and spatial mastery differently from the norm, and how it continually recontextualizes the space you play in. You can't really learn the space in PUBG, at least not in the standard sense. There's just too much of it. The biggest maps are so colossal that just one of them could contain entire shooter campaigns. And the others aren't exactly tiny either. You could spend hundreds of hours playing on these and still find things you've not seen, or quirks and intricacies to what you have seen. It's simply unreasonable to ask a player to internalize every inch of these maps, like a player might be expected to in other shooters. Fortunately, PUBG doesn't ask you to. Instead, it wants you to intuit the space. It presents it naturalistically. These aren't constructed arenas that players will be carefully directed down, but areas which are generally open-ended and broadly believable. Buildings and layouts do repeat, and things definitely aren't completely logical, but they do have a certain verisimilitude, in a way that the artificially narrow corridors and arbitrary boundaries of standard shooter maps often don't. You can more often draw on your understanding of real-world space in PUBG. Of course, having so much space means that a lot of it is less intricately designed, and one compound can feel much the same as another. But what allows the often generic space of PUBG to really sing, the mechanism for that recontextualization I mentioned earlier, is the circle mechanic. So, to give an overview for people not familiar with PUBG or Battle Royale games in general, the idea is that up to 100 players get dropped onto a huge island. Players scavenge for weapons and equipment, but after a few minutes a big circle gets highlighted on the map. After a few more minutes the playable area will begin to shrink to this circle, and after it has, the cycle repeats with the circles getting progressively smaller. You don't have to be inside the circle, but being outside means you'll take damage, and as the game goes on that damage ramps up pretty steeply. What this does is take otherwise unremarkable space and makes it interesting by shifting the boundaries, and thus the meaning and usefulness of every compound and bit of cover in the circle. So you might have an area like this, that you just drive past and barely notice. But when there's a final circle around here, suddenly every single hay bale is a vitally important bit of cover. It becomes a dynamic arena that you can't have planned for. Micro details become macro ones, and the quality of a position becomes dependent on the specific circle and distribution of players. Take this compound, for example. If in the centre of the circle, then it's basically the best position possible. It's central, well defended, and has good sightlines to most of the circle. You can survey a lot of the remaining space from a position of safety, and enemies will have to risk themselves to get to you. There's limited cover on the approach. But what if we shift the circle like this? Now it's at the very edge of the circle, meaning that as it shrinks further you'll likely be forced to leave, which will put you right into the open. And now everyone else has good sightlines on you. Move it just a little this way and suddenly it's not in the circle at all and there's even more pressure. In different circles, the same features have different contexts. And further chaos is injected by the randomness of other players, where they're positioned and how the final conflicts play out. And this is all true on both a micro and a macro scale. The meaningfulness of specific trees, rocks or houses might shift, but so too might larger features like an entire field or slope. As the circle shrinks, micro features become proportionally more important, but large features can have variable meaning too. Based on your distance to the circle and where you think enemies might be, you might need to decide between a direct but risky route, or a safer, slower approach that could have you running with a circle on your heels. Or take something like this little valley. With this circle, you'd want to move north, but the way you'd normally travel is, in this context, an incredibly dangerous shooting gallery that you'd want to avoid at all costs. It'd just be too easy for someone to spot you and kill you. So instead, given that this circle makes it less likely people would see you from the low ground to the southeast, you might choose to climb and travel around this little mountain, as in this instance it means you have good cover, good sightlines and lower risk, even though at an earlier point in the game you wouldn't think twice about zooming through the valley, and going around the peak of the mountain would have been an unnecessary pain in the ass. So the name of the game becomes adapting to situations. You have to learn to identify how much protection and advantage you can squeeze out of the terrain. You're not supposed to win in this game just by going in guns blazing and outshooting the opponent. You can do that, but PUBG matches are more often won by positioning and tactics. What this all means is that the game asks you to learn its space in a looser, more dynamic sense. Expressing mastery over it isn't about knowing the space, but knowing how to use it. Compared to normal shooters, it's like the difference between memorizing versus extrapolating from base principles. Using space well is so crucial to victory that PUBG's form of spatial mastery, though very different from most competitive shooters, is an equally large part of the overall mastery curve. Even though the circles are random and you'll always have to improvise, if you're consistent at making smart moves across the map and positioning yourself well, you can consistently put yourself in a winning position. On the other hand though, there's so many explicit decisions you need to make each game, and you can't always shoot your way out of mistakes. So being skilled at making those decisions can actually end up being a lot more important than in games where bad decisions can be recovered from with good shooting. So far, I've mostly focused on the idea of the space as it exists in the game, recontextualized primarily by how the circles frame it. But what makes it truly dynamic is how it also interacts with the players. Most competitive shooters are team-based, so the space usually gets carved up between two sides. In PUBG though, more individual teams have to share space. Even late game circles can get pretty populated, a lot of individual agents milling about and crashing into each other. And handling this well is one of PUBG's greatest challenges. People could be hiding around any corner, and 10 minutes of silence can transition into an intense fight at the drop of a hat. You have to determine how to claim an area, how to flush people out and where enemies might be, whether or not you take engagements, and what you do about the fights that you can't avoid. It's an intricate combat puzzle, one randomly generated multiple times per game by the combined unpredictability of the circle and the players. So the space changes meaning in one way based on the circle, but in another based on the chaotic actions of the other players. It's pretty common to have to totally adjust your plan, because randomly 2/3 of the remaining players ended up having it out in just one part of the circle. And information about who is where becomes crucial. By listening to shots and keeping track of the kill feed, you can build up a map of the remaining players' locations. and the space will be further carved up and given you meaning by this information. Maybe you change your mind about taking a compound, maybe you lie low or set an ambush, or you decide to be a third party to a conflict and take an injured squad unawares. There's so many possibilities, and it's just all so dynamic in a way that feels unique to PUBG, even amongst other battle royales, just due to how the physical space does so much contextualize player action. Your entire endgame plan can't really revolve as much around terrain features or a single well-placed bit of cover, in a game where you build your own or move so fast you barely need to use any. Ultimately, PUBG isn't the first or only shooter to do interesting things here. I've recently been playing a lot of Rainbow Six Siege and Deep Rock Galactic, for example, and these and many other shooters are doing fascinating things with space and terrain. But I feel none of them do it quite like PUBG does, or rely so purely on the mechanical elegance of their systems. Other shooters tend to have more polish, more intricate design, better textures, and less bugs. But PUBG's genius is in taking its boring building blocks and leveraging them into something incredible. It recontextualizes its space on so many levels and in so many ways, and I've never played anything that made the micro features of space feel so relevant and meaningful. I can list so many things wrong with the game, but they're all so easy to ignore when PUBG is doing what it does best, using its systems and dynamic space to generate stories, unique journeys with their own challenges and endings. Its endgames haven't stopped feeling unique and pulse-pounding after 1,000 hours played. It challenges you in a way all its own, and rewards smart adaptive thinking in such a seamless, natural, and unscripted way. And when you pull out a win, the high is like nothing else. So while a lot of shooters might technically be better games, none have impressed me quite like PUBG has. Thanks for watching.